TV.
All right, the United Nations is working or organizing a food systems summit. And to speak to us about this and more, we have Gertrude Namanje. She shall be joining us later on. She's the principal policy analyst at the Office of the Prime Minister. We also have Dr. John Jagwe, the country director for the Alliance for Green Revolution, and Mr. Katiama. Yes, Robert. He is the head nutrition, food systems and gender at the World Food Programme. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Let me start with you, Mr. Atiagama. What is the United Nations Food Systems Summit and its objectives, sir?
Thanks very much for the question. Let me start by defining what the Food Systems Summit is really about. The Food Systems Summit has been convened by His Excellency, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and it will be happening this year sometime in September. The goal of the United Nations Food Systems Summit is to launch bold new actions that deliver on the progress of all the 17 SDGs. The reason for this is that there continues to be lack of achievement in the SDGs, particularly SDG 2. And so the goal of this summit is aimed at helping countries think through the various food systems that they have. We all must aim to achieve and transform the food system so that it produces the necessary actions that we have. So we want to make sure that we have healthier, sustainable, and equitable food systems for all categories of people across the different countries. In Uganda, this is particularly important if you look at where we are now with coronavirus and also even the lockdown. A functioning food system is critical to ensure that people are able to access food, people are able to afford food, people are able to buy food as much as is needed, and to make sure that not only affordability, availability, and access, but also ensuring that the various systems that are in place around transportation, around market systems, around innovation, around trade, around policies, are all in place such that they can enable a country's food system function properly. So this is the reason why the United Nations Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, is calling on the world to have a dialogue on food systems so that we can better and equitably serve the population.
Dr. Jagwe, let's also talk about the opportunities therein. What opportunities are there when it comes to the United Nations Food Systems Summit for the Ugandans here?
Thank you very much. Good morning, viewers. For you, like my colleague Robert has mentioned, food is critical. And we can't emphasize this any further than this time when we see the COVID-19 situation hammering on us, and the lifeline is food. Like it has been mentioned, when the world made its plan for a better world and came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, the goal number 2 was zero hunger. Yes, and we are working towards that goal to be attained in 2030. And so, like Robert has said, these dialogues are happening not only in Uganda, but they are going to happen in all countries, and then come up with common positions that should inform our policymakers, our planners, and our development partners on how we can achieve this goal of zero hunger and have sustained and sustainable food systems that should be resilient to the vagaries of nature, the stresses of nature, and should be equitable to all. And so for an ordinary citizen, this is the time that your views should be listened to. This is the time that your views should be heard through your agriculture extension officer, through your district local government, on how the food system should be planned. And so at this point, we as Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, which is a continental body, we are glad to be part of this arrangement to support the Office of the Prime Minister, which is the national convener for this summit, on this initiative of dialoguing at regional level and at national level. And so the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, I should also mention that its president, Dr. Agnes Kalibata, was also appointed the UN envoy on food systems by the UN Secretary General. And so this is it. We need to have food, and we need to have it sustainably and equitably. And so this is what this whole summit is about.
Indeed. Dr. Robert, let's talk about the focus of this summit. What are some of those thematic areas that the United Nations Food System Summit is going to be focusing on?
Yeah. Thanks. Let me start with the objectives of the summit. As my brother said, the main objectives are, one, to end hunger. The second one is to achieve healthier diets for all. The third one is to ensure proper use of biodiversity. And then the fourth one is to make sure that we're eliminating poverty by also increasing incomes for all. Now, along these four areas, the Food Systems Summit, as he said, led and convened by His Excellency the Prime Minister, will focus on 5 main tracks, what we call action tracks. Each of these action tracks will provide a platform for citizens to engage and discuss the issues around the food systems. The first action track is about ensuring access to safe and nutritious foods for all. We want to make sure that there is access, but not only access, that the food is also safe. This action track is co-led by the UN agency, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, together with the Ministry of Agriculture here in Uganda. Then we have action track 2.
On that action track, before you go to number 2,
sure.
Are there fears that COVID-19 might dampen your hopes of actually realizing that aspiration?
I think for many countries, this has been the case. But I think for Uganda in particular, this has slightly been different given what we saw in during the last lockdown. It was one of the only countries where food production actually increased because agricultural activities were also there. So on the access side, that might be a little bit more difficult just because people may not have purchasing power to be able to access food. But I think availability may not necessarily be the case here in Uganda. Safety is a different issue. I think there are many issues around food safety, and particularly around post-harvest management and value chain production as well. So there are some issues there, yes, and COVID-19, yes, could substantially impact this particular track.
The second aspiration.
The second aspiration on action track 2 is about shifting to sustainable consumption patterns. Here we want to make sure that people are consuming foods in a sustainable way, but also ensuring that these foods are healthier for their own benefit. Because if you look at the bigger framework of the food systems, the ultimate goal is the individual. How do we ensure that the individual can eat any type of diet that is healthy, but in a sustainable way such that it does not degrade the environment? The third action track is about boosting nature production and at sufficient scale. Here we're talking about issues of climate change, the environment and ecosystems, and how these systems affect the food system in a country. As you know, climate change has its own impact. If you look at areas like in Karamoja with the recent floods in several areas of the country, these have potential impacts. The fourth area is really around advancing equitable livelihoods and value distribution. This is really where we're looking at smallholder farmers, the role they play within production and how this fits into the broader thematic area. If you look at NDP 3, for example, a lot of these thematic areas that I'm mentioning actually fit into a lot of the programs.
We also do know that in that space of the traders, the smallholder traders, we do know that 1.8 million might not go back to pre-pandemic economic activities. So how dire is this situation? And do you envisage a situation whereby if we continue with this total lockdown, more of those traders might not go back to pre-pandemic levels?
Yes, I think as much as that is possible, that actually brings me to the thematic area 5, which is about building resilience to vulnerabilities, shocks, and stresses.
Amazing.
So, for example, as we talk about COVID-19, this is one of the shocks and stresses that any system can face. So how do we ensure that the food system is able to respond to this 1.8 million smallholder farmers that you're talking about? How do we put in the right systems in place? And I think His Excellency the President, through some of the approaches that he has provided along with the lockdown measures, are aimed at easing some of these. But we hope that through the dialogue, we will be able to bring about discussions on these areas. So let me finish by just quickly going through the UN agencies that are supporting each of these action tracks. For Action Track 1, we have Food and Agriculture Organization, as I said. Action Track 2, which is about health-related sustainable consumption patterns. That's led by the co-led by the World Health Organization, WHO. We have Action Track 3, that's led by UNDP here in Uganda. Action Track 4, which I talked about, equitable livelihoods, that's led by IFAD, also a Rome-based agency. And Action Track 5 will be co-led by the World Food Programme.
All right, so I also have the country director for the Alliance for Green Revolution. That's none other than Dr. John Jagwe. Dr. John Jagwe, how do we ensure that what we produce ends up boosting nature, yes, while maintaining sustainable production? How do we ensure that what we produce ends up boosting nature and also while maintaining sustainable production? Dr. Jagwe.
Gladly, Uganda is a blessed country. Good soils, good climate, double seasons.
Indeed.
And so, and good knowledge. We have a knowledge base that you cannot find in many African countries. We have trained people. So, sustained agricultural production is highly attainable. We need to guide farmers on what to do. So we need a strong agricultural extension service.
So when you talk to them, what are some of those challenges they say hamper them from actually achieving sustainable production?
The first will be climate patterns.
Indeed.
Okay, the rainfall, yes, it still comes, but the patterns are changing.
Indeed.
And that needs to be adjusted to, you know.
With irrigation and so forth.
Exactly. Or with water conservation measures.
Water collection tools and so forth.
Yes. And how to mulch and how to do all those agronomic practices that conserve soil moisture.
This is where the agriculture extension workers come through.
Exactly. And our ratios for extension worker to farmer are really miserable.
Indeed.
and they need to be strengthened. And then secondly, markets. Markets drive everything, I can assure you. Markets drive input application, they drive investments into agro inputs, and then they drive adoption of technologies. And so when markets are functioning, and I'm glad that in this COVID-19 situation, markets have been allowed to continue, not only food markets, but also export markets to thrive. And so markets will drive all this adoption of technology and make the farmers more resilient in a world of several stresses. Yeah.
All right, Robert, what else can we do to build resilience to these vulnerabilities, the shocks and the stress that we are seeing?
I think that, at least for us, the World Food Programme leading this Action Track 5, there are several things that we can do, which include the fact that we need to be prepared to manage these shocks. And these include, you know, building community assets through programs like labor-intensive public work programs, ensuring that there is knowledge and systems that are built in place to be able to respond and predict on these actions before they happen. So it's really around taking a proactive approach ahead of time, understanding the risks that are involved with climate change and how best we can mitigate that. So we at the World Food Programme are actually supporting two programs, one in the West Nile region around social protection shock systems, and then also in Karamoja, so that we will be able to help the population and communities better adapt to these climatic impacts, making them more resilient as they go forward. And just to add to the point that he has made, for the Food System Summit, there are various cross-cutting themes that will be brought in during the discussions, primarily around the issues of gender, youth, and the elderly. We also have infrastructure, which is key to food production and food systems. We also have trade and pricing in terms of policy. We have policy and regulation, so the regulatory framework is critical to enable a food system function properly. We also have science and research, because this is also critical in innovation, in bringing in new innovation and technology. We also need to go back and look at indigenous systems. We're tending to forget some of these old practices that actually help sustain our food systems.
What are some of those?
I mean, some of those include, you know, the stopping of consumption of traditional vegetables and crops in our areas. You know, many people don't eat dodo, for example, these days. They'd rather go for a cabbage. You know, so what are some of these systems that we can learn in terms of food processing, food preservation from you know, our past, from our grandparents, great-grandparents, and how can we use these to enhance our own food systems to make them more resilient? We also need to take care of our cultural norms. These are really important, but also, as he said, market systems are really critical as we look at the smallholder farmers who are the majority of people who produce food that we all consume.
Dr. Jagwe, let's talk about the purchasing power of our Ugandans and the fact that nutrition plays a big part when it comes to curtailing the spread of COVID-19. It boosts your immunity, am I right? But then the purchasing power of our citizens has largely dwindled or gone down. Do you envisage a situation whereby our nutrition levels might go down and people might not be having the great immunity that is requisite or needed to fight off this pandemic? And what are partners like yourself and WFP doing to ensure that we stop this?
Yeah, definitely purchasing power is being impacted on negatively by this pandemic. But nonetheless, when the supply of food rises, then there is downward pressure on the prices because of that excess supply. And so we saw in the last year's lockdown situation, food prices collapsing largely, you know. Eggs were selling for 5,000 a tray. You know, and tomatoes and all these, matoke dropped to 5,000 a bunch. And so there is a way in which the system, of course, definitely our purchasing power is dwindling, but at the same time, if we maintain the supply of food, then the situation can be managed. Especially for Uganda, the situation can be managed because Uganda is largely a surplus food producer. And so
Indeed. Now, government's focus right now are the city centers, the Kampala city slums, the youth, the single mothers, the border riders who have been impacted, the taxi operators who have been impacted. But what about the people in the rural areas? The knowledge coming in from government is that they produce more food and they have food and they are well covered. Do you also buy into this, that the people in the rural areas don't need any help from government to access food?
Largely
even
now,
cash stipends.
Largely what now they'll need is means to sell what they have produced so that they can have some cash. Okay? Yeah.
All right. You wanted to pitch in, Robert,
Yes,
before we go for a break? Just a few seconds.
Yes, just a few seconds. Yes. We actually conducted a study on the fuel and nutrient gap in Uganda. And actually 75% of Ugandans cannot afford a nutritious diet. This is really important. So going back to what he said, once food production increases to the point where food prices are low enough for the ordinary Ugandan to buy and consume foods, then we can assure that Ugandans will have a nutritious diet that encompasses all that we expect people
Amazing
to
insights,
consume.
Robert and Dr. Jagwe. Thank you very much for coming through. We also have Gertrude Namayanje, a principal policy analyst at the Office of the Prime Minister. She's going to be joining us to talk about this side of the government and what interventions have been put in place to ensure that we alleviate this problem. Access to safe and nutritious food. We'll be right back.